Welcome, dear learners, to week 6, which is about climate fiction. Climate fiction is a recent development in literature, let's say coming from the 1970s onwards, because climate as a concern was always there in science fiction. When we talk of uh, ruined futures, dystopian futures, when we talk about uh, the unlivable earth, where people have to go to other planets to stay. So, those ideas which we get from the science fiction that is written by Asimov or Philip K. Dick, it all talks about things that are related to a ruined planet, a ruined earth. So they are flashes here and there, or they are completely altered and dystopian worlds which now belong to the area of climate fiction, but they were a part of science fiction. So there is a lot of overlapping between science fiction and climate fiction, much in common between the two. So, what is the definition of climate fiction? It is a subgenre of speculative fiction that specifically focuses on the realities and potential impacts of climate change and environmental crisis. So, it has grown out of science fiction, and it is concerned with the planet, and it has developed in the late 20th century, and we can see that being called climate fiction, whereas there used to be science fiction before this. So, if we read the works of old masters of science fiction, we will still see flashes of climate concern, or flashes of ideas of a ruined and a destroyed earth, or ideas about human indifference and human insensitivity to the planet. And climate fiction itself focuses now on the realities and the potential impacts of climate change and environmental crisis. History and evolution of the genre. The roots of climate change can be traced to early works for speculative fiction and science fiction that addressed environmental concerns. So, as I just said, the works of Asimov or the works of Philip K. Dick, they deal with ideas of numerous environments across the universe, which are other than the Earth. So, a lot of the stories are extraterrestrial. There's a lot of science and a lot of space science involved, a lot of physics involved in many of these stories. This genre began to shape more prominently in the late 20th and the early 21st centuries. The early influences for this genre were Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, J.G. Ballard, who explored environmental and ecological themes in their works. So, very famous books are there by these writers. We already know about The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, The Invisible Man. So, the very idea of technology, which is taken up by these stories of H.G. Wells, they also tell us how human beings get hypnotized and get obsessed with technology so as to ignore the values of true living, the value of heart and soul. So, Jules Verne also, his work also tells about this human indifference and insensitivity to certain um, values of everyday life, and their works will be discussed later. So these writers, as I mentioned, and Philip K. Dick also, they also explore environmental and ecological themes in their works. contemporary emergence of climate fiction. It was in the early 21st century climate fiction started to develop as its own genre. So, as I mentioned just now, that originally climate concerns were somewhere in science fiction, and as the concerns began to grow, and then the movements, environmental movements, after the publication of The Silent Spring came along. So those inspired a whole lot of new writing. And then we had, towards the latter part of the 20th century, the IPCC and the reports of climate change and carbon content, creating a cause for concern and creating an urgency to address climate change. So more and more writing came up, and so it came into its own identity in the 21st century. Scientific concern over climate change and events like Hurricane Katrina 2005 played a pivotal role in bringing it into cultural conversation. So, climate change became the talk of the table after there were numerous hurricanes, and so Hurricane Katrina was an important landmark. After that, climate change started being discussed, and thus the stories also um, that came up were into a new identity. Of course, it was not entirely new because the science fiction tropes are there in climate fiction too. So, authors like Margaret Atwood, Oryx and Crake, 2003, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry of the Future, 2020, helped establish climate fiction as a recognized genre. So, Margaret Atwood's novel Oryx and Crake was important because um, she claimed that she was not writing feminist fiction, but she's known. She did not even say that she was writing climate fiction, but her work is part science fiction and part climate fiction because it deals with a dystopian world, a world created by human intelligence and genius, which is a plastic world where the real human world is ruined. So, this transition from the real world where humanity thrives and lives, and then the transition into other worlds, that's a common theme in climate fiction and also a common theme in science fiction. So, these writers helped establish the genre of climate fiction. What is the difference between climate fiction and other speculative genres? Climate fiction versus science fiction. Science fiction often explores futuristic technologies, space travel, artificial intelligence, and the impact of scientific innovations on society. Uh, Between science fiction, there's a soft version and a hard version. The hard science fiction deals with the core of subjects like physics and chemistry and is hard to understand for a lay reader, whereas soft science fiction makes the appearance or the expression of science more gentle and more easy to understand. So, so it can be of two kinds, and there are so many things that are dealt with in science fiction and can be dealt in climate fiction too. The stories of robots, the future technologies, the altered worlds, the new botanical plants, or the new breeds of animals or living things because of genetic transfers and genetic experimentation. Some of these ideas are there in Margaret Atwood's works also. So, scientific innovations are dealt with, and in climate fiction, The primary concern may be with the Earth's ecological systems and the impact of climate change on them and on humanity. But climate fiction focuses very strongly on the human connection with nature, uh, that and it attempts to build on those lost values. It tries to bring home the idea of those lost values, and science fiction may not do that. Science fiction might talk about uh, the future, the altered futures, and might talk about innovations, technology, a plastic world, uh, a world of robots or a world of IA. Uh, but human connection might be there, but it's not so strongly emphasized as it is in climate fiction. Because climate fiction, the very aim is to create awareness about the impact on uh, human beings and other living beings on the planet. Climate fiction versus dystopian fiction. Dystopian fiction often deals with authoritarian governments, social control, and breakdown of societal norms, frequently set in a grim, oppressive future. So the dystopian fiction, it sort of goes into many divisions and subdivisions. It could be about authoritarian. It could be these authoritarian regimes springing out of a necessity for survival. It could be something that opposes the social norms, something that goes totally against the current traditional system of life and routines. So it's the opposite of utopian. Utopian means something that is ideal, but dystopian is anything that is not ideal, that goes against this idea of ideal. So we have such works um, which have been translated into films in Hindi literature also, and in climate fiction there is a direct focus on environmental crisis, with climate change acting as a catalyst for social collapse and transformation. So, whereas in dystopian fiction, the idea of human beings transcending the limits of being human and being transformed into semi robots, ideas like these, they give a thrill and they sort of make the story interesting. And on the side, there might be a comment of the impending future of human beings. This is what it might be, a kind of warning. But there's not a direct focus on environmental crisis. Climate fiction focuses directly on environmental crisis, and the climate change acts as a catalyst for social collapse and transformation. So, between them, when the world turns dystopian, in the dystopian science fiction, there is a breakdown of society, social collapse, and a transformation. But it is shown coming through climate change, but climate change is not emphasized in such a way. So, climate change stories will emphasize the change of climate, the loss of habitats, the destruction of uh, biodiversity. So, there are many short stories too which focus on individual animals, maybe the polar bear or owls or squirrels. The primary example is Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind Up Girl. So that is 2009. Climate fiction versus apocalyptic fiction. Once again, climate can be part of apocalyptic fiction, as in that novel that we mentioned earlier, The Rapture, in which there is a belief of doom, and the whole novel is based on that. That there is a belief that the biblical idea that there will be an end of the world which is coming soon. So, uh, climate fiction in that novel, the climate is also climate change and climate also under consideration. The doom is twofold. One has to think whether it is God created or it is created by humans. So, apocalyptic fiction, it talks about climate change too, as in this novel, The Rapture. And so, while apocalyptic fiction deals with the end of the world or civilization through catastrophes like war, pandemics, and natural disasters, climate fiction focuses especially on climate change as a driving force behind apocalyptic scenarios. So, as I mentioned, the book, The Rapture, uh, that there are two things. There is a belief that the world will come to an end, and also there is a climate impact that is being created to hasten that end. It is the greed for to capture certain chemicals from under the ocean, and which, if let loose, could destroy the entire earth, and eventually that happens. So the apocalypse is correct that the world is going to come to an end. So we have climate there also, and we have religion also there. Examples: Cormac McCarthy's The Road, 2006, about unspecified disaster leads to the collapse of civilization. So, this book has been a very successful movie also, and it might enter our discussions later. Nathaniel Rich's Odds Against Tomorrow. So, climate fiction is there as part of apocalyptic fiction if you read these novels. What is the purpose and significance of climate fiction in contemporary literature? As I mentioned earlier, one of the purposes of climate fiction is to raise awareness. When we talk about science fiction, uh, awareness is sidelined. It comes, the prediction of doom is there, but the story doesn't focus on that. There's rather a thrill, and these science fiction uh, texts and stories have turned into very successful movies because the thrill of extraterrestrial life and semi-human robots and the powers of the AI, all those are shown. So that focus on awareness is not there. So climate fiction is there to raise awareness. It encourages discovering lost values, remembering empathy that used to exist earlier between animals and between humans. It inspires solutions, it inspires actions, it critiques human hubris and industrialization, it offers hope or creates an awakening. So, climate fiction aims at creating awakening and awareness by making the stories uh, ring with reality. There is a sensibility in these stories, there's a feel in these stories that catches and that makes one alert, and especially when there are stories that do not distract us in the by those parts of science fiction like the thrill of extraterrestrial life, um, strange innovations. Rather, they might be focused on one single element of climate impact, and the focus remains on that, and the story revolves around that. So there are several stories that we will consider later on, and climate fiction also is about inspiring and suggesting solutions to the problems of today. Climate fiction also takes up cultural settings, whether it can be a Korean setup or a Chinese setup or an Indian setup, depending on who the writer is. That real cultural setting, that sense of reality in the life of that character, in the life of that place, inspires a humanizing feeling when you read those stories. Also, it criticizes this sense of human isolation or separation from nature. It tries to inspire them to come together. It inspires man and nature to come together. It inspires man to understand his guardianship. It inspires man to realize the lost values which connected him with the land. And climate fiction could be based on realities of local life, of regional cultures. So it could be based on local life and regional cultures.